The 1%. Part 2. The 1% Rule. MXDM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. April 6th, 2026. Part 2. The 1% Doctrine. 6. The 1% Rule. Somewhere inside the legal infrastructure of urban development, quietly embedded in the planning codes and municipal ordinances of cities across the world, there exists a rule that nobody talks about as a civilizational mechanism. It goes by different names in different jurisdictions. Percent for art, public art allocation, cultural set-aside, art in architecture. The names vary. The structure is consistent. When a development project exceeds a certain scale, a threshold defined in square footage or construction cost, or some combination of both, a mandatory fraction of the total budget must be allocated to art. Not to marketing, not to amenities, not to the green spaces and water features and lobby installations that developers deploy as lifestyle signifiers for their target demographics. To art, to the non-productive, non-extractive, non-utilitarian category of human creation that a civilization designates as existing outside the logic of economic return. 1%. In most jurisdictions that have formalized it, 1%. The number is small enough to be absorbed without protest into the economics of large-scale development. It is large enough at the scale of a billion-dollar project to fund an installation of genuine ambition. It is, in the accounting of the developers who comply with it, a cost of doing business, a tax dressed as culture, a regulatory obligation dressed as patronage, discharged through the commissioning of a sculpture for the plaza, or a mural for the lobby, or a light installation for the facade that satisfies the requirement and does not interfere with the primary business of selling or leasing the remaining 99%. This is how the rule is understood by those who pay for it. It is not how the rule should be understood. The 1% rule, read not as a regulatory burden, but as a structural fact about the organization of capital and meaning in modern civilization, is one of the most remarkable features of the built environment that industrial society has produced. It is remarkable not for what it currently does, which is in most cases modest, decorative, and beneath the weight of its own potential, but for what it structurally is. It is a legally mandated non-economic zone inside the economic system. Let that sit for a moment, because its implications extend far beyond art procurement. Every other allocation in a large-scale development is governed by the logic of return. The residential units must be priced to generate a margin. The commercial spaces must attract tenants whose rents justify the construction cost. The parking must accommodate the vehicles of the people who will occupy the building. The lobby must project the right signal to the right demographic to support the desired price point. Even the green spaces, the parks, the courtyards, the carefully landscaped transitional zones are economic instruments priced into the development's value proposition, their existence justified by the premium they allow the developer to charge for proximity to them. The 1% is different. The 1% is the only allocation in the entire development budget that is explicitly prohibited from justifying itself through economic return. It cannot be a revenue-generating amenity. It cannot be a marketing instrument dressed as art. It must be art, which is to say, it must be the thing that the economic system has historically designated as existing outside its own logic, as belonging to a different order of value, as maturing for reasons that the market cannot fully price and is not, in the instance of this specific allocation, required to price. This is extraordinary, not because it is large, 1% is not large, but because of what it proves. It proves that the economic system, at the apex of its own operations, in its largest, most capital-intensive, most profit-optimized undertakings, contains, by legal requirement, a space that is governed by a different logic, a space that acknowledges, in the language of law and regulation and enforceable obligation, the human civilization requires something that economic return cannot provide and is not being asked to provide. That acknowledgement is not incidental. It is not a concession extracted reluctantly from a system that would prefer to eliminate it. It is a durable feature of the built environment in every advanced economy that has thought carefully about what cities are for. It persists because the civilizations that produced it understood, at some level that the accounting spreadsheet cannot capture, that the purely economic city, the city organized entirely around productive function and market return, is a city that cannot sustain the human life it is built to house. The 1% is the economic system's admission that it cannot provide everything. That admission is currently being made at the scale of a sculpture in a plaza, at the scale of a mural that the building's occupants pass without noticing, at the scale of a light installation that the developer's publicist includes in the press kit for the opening and that no one discusses afterward. The doctrine proposed here begins with a different reading of that admission. If the economic system acknowledges, in its own regulatory infrastructure, that 1% of its largest operations must be allocated to the non-economic, then the question is not whether that allocation should exist. It already exists. The question is what it should be. What should the non-economic zone inside the largest capital deployments of the current moment contain? The standard answer: a sculpture, a mural, a fountain, a publicly accessible artwork that satisfies the regulatory requirement, adds a line to the press release, and gets photographed for the building's marketing materials. The 1% doctrine proposes a different answer. The non-economic zone should be a transition infrastructure for the civilization that the development is accelerating. This is not a poetic reframing. It is a logical extension of the rule's own internal justification. The percent for art rule exists because cities recognize that large-scale development changes the character of the places it occupies, that it reshapes the spatial, social, and cultural fabric of neighborhoods and districts in ways that are not fully captured by its economic benefits, that the people who live in proximity to large developments are owed something beyond the tax base and the employment the development provides, something that acknowledges the non-economic dimensions of what they are living inside. In the moment we are now in, the large-scale developments of luxury real estate, technology campuses, and mixed-use urban complexes are not merely changing the character of specific neighborhoods. They're being built by and for the class that is most directly accelerating the cognitive equalization and the displacement wave described in Part 1. The capital being deployed in these developments is, in significant measure, capital generated by the technological transformation that is dissolving the employment base of the population surrounding them. The 1% allocation is therefore not merely a cultural obligation. It is, in the specific context of this moment, a transition obligation. The development that is built on capital generated by automation owes the communities it occupies something more than a sculpture in the plaza. It owes them a space that acknowledges the transition they are inside and provides infrastructure for navigating it. Not charity, not public relations, a genuine, functional, architecturally committed space that takes seriously the question of what people do when the employment that organized their lives has been dissolved by the same capital that is funding the development they are now living beside. This is what the 1% rule becomes when it is read at the scale of the current moment. Not 1% for art, 1% for transition. The distinction matters for what gets built. A sculpture answers the requirement of the rule as currently written and currently interpreted. A transition campus, a space of participation, sense-making, dream validation, and the development of post-employment identity and role, answers the requirement of the rule as it should be interpreted in the specific historical conditions of the 21st century. The legal infrastructure already exists. The funding obligation already exists. The only thing that does not yet exist is the ambition to use what the rule provides for what the moment requires. There is a second dimension of the 1% rule that the doctrine extends beyond its current application. The rule, as legally codified, applies to individual developments. Each project satisfies its own obligation independently. The sculpture in the plaza of one building has no relationship to the sculpture in the plaza of the next building. The allocations are disconnected, each one a discrete discharge of a discrete obligation, producing no accumulation, no network, no architecture of the scale of the city or the district or the civilization. The 1% doctrine proposes that these allocations be understood and, where possible, coordinated as a distributed network of transition infrastructure. Not each project satisfying its own obligation in isolation, but developments within a shared geography or shared investment thesis contributing their 1% allocations toward a common transition architecture that serves the population their combined development is displacing. This coordination is not legally required by the current formulation of the rule. It is not legally prohibited by it either. It is a choice, available to developers with a vision to see that the value of their own development is enhanced by the quality of the transition infrastructure surrounding it, and available to cities with the governance capacity to incentivize coordination rather than merely mandate individual compliance. At its most realized expression, this coordination produces something the rule was never designed to produce, but is structurally capable of producing: a network of 1% zones that collectively constitute a meaningful alternative spatial layer within the city. Not the primary layer, not replacing the economic infrastructure that the 99% funds, but existing alongside it as a permanent, distributed, architecturally legible commitment to the non-economic dimensions of collective life. The 1% of each development, added together, coordinated, directed toward a shared purpose. At the scale of a city, this becomes a significant resource. At the scale of a global development ecosystem, it becomes something unprecedented, a civilizational funding mechanism for the infrastructure of meaning embedded in the very operations of the capital system that is generating the need for it. The mechanism already exists. The obligation already exists. The capital is already being deployed. The only question is whether the 1% is spent on a sculpture that no one will remember in 10 years, or on the first instances of the infrastructure that will define how this civilization navigates the transition it is already inside. This is not a question about art versus practicality. The dream catcher at the center of the first 1% campus is art, land scale, symbolically sovereign, architecturally permanent art, the most ambitious public artwork of its generation. Art and transition infrastructure are not in tension in this doctrine. They're the same thing when art is understood at its full ambition. The sculpture in the plaza is what art looks like when it asks nothing of the civilization it inhabits. The dream catcher is what art looks like when it accepts the full weight of the moment it is made in. 1%, the same fraction, a completely different civilization. 7. Luxury as transition engine. The instinct, when confronting the scale of displacement that the cognitive equalization is producing, is to look toward the state. It is the instinct that every previous transition wave has produced, and it is not wrong. The state is the institution with the legal authority to compel redistribution, the scale to deploy resources at the level the transition requires, and the democratic mandate, however contested, however eroded by the legitimacy crisis described in the previous chapter, to act in the interest of populations that the market will not act for. The automation tax, the billionaire levy, the universal basic income, the retraining subsidy. These are state instruments, and the case for deploying them at scale is real and will be made, is being made, and will eventually prevail in some form in most advanced economies. But the state is slow, not as a criticism, as a structural description. The state is slow because it operates through democratic deliberation, which requires building coalitions across constituencies with conflicting interests and time horizons. It is slow because it operates through legislative process, which requires translating the urgency of a fast-moving technological transition into the language of law, which is inherently backward-looking, designed to codify what has already been understood rather than to anticipate what is not yet legible. It is slow because it operates through bureaucratic implementation, which requires building the administrative capacity to deploy resources at the scale the policy mandates. And administrative capacity is the slowest growing resource in the institutional ecosystem. The transition is not slow. The gap between the speed of displacement and the speed of the state's capacity to respond to it is not a policy failure. It is a structural feature of democratic governance operating inside a technological acceleration it did not produce and cannot control. The gap will close, eventually, as it has closed in previous transitions. But in the interval, which will be measured in years, possibly in decades, the populations inside the transition are not waiting for the state to catch up. They're living the transition now in the absence of the infrastructure the state has not yet built. Something must act before the state is ready. The argument of this chapter is that luxury, specifically the high-end real estate and development sector operating at the frontier of the global capital market, is structurally positioned to be that something. Not as charity, not as philanthropy, not as corporate social responsibility deployed to manage reputational risk, but as a transition engine, a capital system that can move at the speed the transition requires, at the scale the transition demands, in the specific geographies where the transition is most acute, in advance of the state mechanisms that will eventually formalize what private capital has already prototyped. This argument requires unpacking several assumptions that are likely to resist it. The first is the assumption that luxury and transition are naturally opposed, that the concentration of capital required to produce luxury development is itself a primary driver of the displacement that transition infrastructure needs to address, and that asking luxury to fund the response to its own effects is either naive or cynical. This assumption is not without foundation. The capital that builds luxury developments in Tulum and Miami and Dubai and London is, in significant measure, capital that has been generated by the same technological transformation that is dissolving the employment base of the populations those developments displace. The developer who builds a luxury resort on land that was previously a fishing community is not, in any simple accounting, the natural ally of the fishing community's transition into the post-employment era. But the argument here is not about the moral character of luxury capital. It is about its structural position. Luxury development has three properties that make it the most viable early-stage transition engine available in the current moment. The first is scale and speed. Luxury development operates at a scale, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars per project, and a speed, years from conception to completion, compared to the decades of legislative and bureaucratic process required for state infrastructure, that matches the urgency of the transition. The private developer who decides to embed a genuine transition campus in a billion-dollar development can break ground within a planning cycle. The state that decides to build equivalent infrastructure must first pass the enabling legislation, then appropriate the funds, then build the administrative capacity, then issue the procurement, then manage the political pressures that will attach to every step of the process. The developer moves faster. In the interval between private prototype and public adoption, the prototype is doing work that nothing else is doing. The second is differentiation value. Luxury developments do not compete primarily on functional specifications. A luxury resort in Tulum competes against other luxury resorts in Tulum, and against luxury resorts in Bali and the Maldives and the Algarve and every other geography that the global high-net-worth population has designated as a destination. In that competition, functional parity is the baseline. Every development at this level offers the expected quality of materials, service, privacy, and amenity. What differentiates is everything that exceeds the baseline. The story, the identity, the sense that this specific place has a relationship to its moment in history that no other place has. The 1% transition campus is, in this competitive landscape, an extraordinary differentiator. Not because it is philanthropic, the luxury market is saturated with philanthropic positioning, but because it is real, a genuine piece of land-scale art that is the most ambitious public artwork of its generation. A governance process that is actually doing something historically unprecedented. A campus that is actually receiving the displaced and actually building the infrastructure of meaning that no government has yet built. These are not marketing claims that can be replicated by a competitor with a better agency. They are facts on the ground that derive their value precisely from being first, from being original, from being the founding instance of something that the civilization recognizes at some level below the explicit as necessary. The luxury development that houses the first 1% campus is not merely selling real estate. It is selling proximity to the first architecture of the post-scarcity transition. That is a value proposition with no competitor, because there is, by definition, only one first. The third is the alignment of excess with need. Luxury development generates surplus, economic, spatial, cultural, that exceeds what the development's primary function requires. The high-end resort does not need a billion-dollar campus to attract its target demographic. The luxury residential development does not need a transition governance process to sell its units. The excess is real. The margins at the luxury end of the real estate market are the highest in the sector, and the differentiation premium that a genuinely distinctive development can command is significant. The 1% allocation is, in the economics of luxury development, not a sacrifice. It is a reallocation of a fraction of the surplus from the category of expenditure that produces marginal returns to the category of expenditure that produces transformative ones. This is the transition engine argument in its simplest form. Luxury development has surplus that exceeds its own needs, operates at the scale and speed that the transition requires, and can generate differentiation value from genuine transition infrastructure that no other form of investment can replicate. The alignment between what luxury development has to offer and what the transition needs to receive is not accidental. It is structural. There's a third class of objection to the luxury as transition engine argument that deserves direct engagement, because it will come from the people most committed to the transition itself. The objection is that transition infrastructure funded by and embedded within luxury development is not genuinely accessible to the displaced populations it is meant to serve. That a transition campus in a billion-dollar resort in Tulum is a campus for the clients of the resort, not for the taxi drivers of Cancun or the former call center workers of Monterey. That the aesthetic and social context of luxury development is itself a form of exclusion. That the displaced worker who arrives at a campus surrounded by the architecture of high-end hospitality is not arriving in a space that was built for her and will know it and will not return. This objection is serious and must be answered seriously. The answer is not that the objection is wrong. The risk it names is real. Transition infrastructure embedded in luxury development can become a showcase for the conscience of the developer rather than a genuine resource for the displaced. The dream validation process can become a performance of participation rather than a genuine exercise of it. The campus can become a cultural amenity for the resort's guests rather than a working infrastructure for the transition. These are failure modes, not inevitabilities. They are the failure modes that the governance architecture of the 1% doctrine is specifically designed to prevent. Through the genuine inclusion of displaced populations in the dream validation process, through the physical and social design of the campus as a space of encounter rather than a space of spectacle, through the independence of the campus's governance from the commercial imperatives of the development that funds it. The luxury development funds the campus. It does not govern it. That distinction is the structural guarantee against capture. The developer provides the land, the capital, the 1% allocation. The campus is governed by its own process, by the dream validation architecture, by the community it serves, by the principles of the 1% doctrine that precede any specific development and survive any specific developer's commercial interests. This is not a naive arrangement. It requires legal architecture to protect it, governance structures that insulate the campus's operational independence from the development's commercial management. It requires ongoing vigilance against the drift toward showcase and away from substance. It requires the kind of sovereign authorship of the doctrine that ensures the framework cannot be quietly redefined by whoever happens to be funding its current instance. That sovereign authorship is what this publication establishes. The doctrine exists independently of any development. Any development that adopts the doctrine is adopting something it did not create and cannot own. The terms of the adoption are set by the doctrine, not by the developer. This is the guarantee that luxury functions as transition engine rather than transition decoration. Not trust in the goodwill of capital. Goodwill is not a governance mechanism. but the structural subordination of capital's role to a doctrine that capital funds but does not control. There is a final dimension of the luxury as transition engine argument that connects it to the longest arc of the transition. The moment we are inside is not the destination. Post-scarcity, in its full expression, is not a condition that luxury development will produce or that any single doctrine will architect. It is a civilizational emergence, a phase transition that will unfold across generations through the accumulated effect of thousands of local experiments, institutional adaptations, governance innovations, and spatial interventions that together constitute a new organizing principle for collective life. Luxury, as a transition engine, is appropriate to the current phase, the phase in which private capital moves faster than public infrastructure, in which the prototype must precede the policy, in which the first instances of the new spatial and governance models must be built by whoever is capable of building them before the state has developed the capacity to build them at scale. But luxury is not the permanent engine of the post-scarcity transition. It is the first engine, the one available now, in the specific conditions of the current moment, capable of moving at the required speed with the required resources. As the transition advances, as the automation tax and the billionaire levy and the universal basic income and the retraining infrastructure of the state eventually catch up to the speed of the displacement they are responding to, the funding base of transition infrastructure will broaden. The 1% allocation embedded in luxury development will be joined by the public allocations that the state, having seen the private prototype, will eventually mandate at scale. The campus that began as a feature of a billion-dollar resort will become the model for campuses that the city builds, that the federal government funds, that the international development architecture deploys across the geographies of the global transition. The private prototype becomes the public policy. The luxury experiment becomes the civilizational standard. The 1% rule becomes the transition tax by another name. This is how template transitions work. Not top-down imposition of a design solution, but bottom-up emergence of a proven model, from prototype to replication, from first instance to global standard, from the specific generosity of one development to the structural obligation of an entire system. Luxury builds a first one. The world builds the rest. That is the transition engine argument in its complete form. Not luxury as solution. Luxury as ignition. 8. Development as civilizational infrastructure. Every era of civilization has had a primary building type. Not the most beautiful building of the era, nor the most technologically ambitious, nor the most symbolically charged, though the primary building type is often all of these things as well. The primary building type is the one that, more than any other, organizes the spatial, social, and economic logic of its moment. The one that determines where people go and why. The one that concentrates capital, attracts population, generates the density of human activity from which culture and commerce and governance emerge. The one that, when you look back from a distance of centuries, tells you what a civilization understood itself to be for. The temple was the primary building type of the ancient city. Not because every ancient city was primarily religious. The economies of Athens and Rome were not primarily religious economies, but because the temple was the structure around which the city's understanding of its own purpose was organized. It was where the city's relationship to the forces that exceeded it was negotiated, where collective identity was performed, where the resources of the community were concentrated into a form that expressed what the community believed it was. The cathedral extended this logic across the medieval millennium, adding to the temple's religious function the spatial organization of the surrounding city. The market, the school, the hospital, the administrative center all arrayed around the cathedral's gravitational field, the building's height a literal index of what the civilization pointed toward. The factory was the primary building type of industrial civilization. This is less obvious than the temple and the cathedral because the factory lacks their aesthetic ambition. It is deliberately a building stripped of symbolic pretension, organized entirely around productive function. But that functional austerity is precisely what makes it the honest expression of industrial civilization's organizing principle. The factory concentrated labor, capital, and productive capacity in a single structure and produced, around it, the housing, the commerce, the transportation infrastructure, and the social organization of the industrial city. The factory did not merely make things. It made the city that surrounded it, and the class structures that organized that city, and the political formations that those class structures produced. The office tower was the primary building type of the post-industrial century. The shift from factory to tower was the spatial expression of the shift from physical to cognitive labor as the dominant form of economic activity, from the production of things to the production of decisions, analysis, coordination, and the complex information processing that the service economy required. The tower concentrated the cognitive layer of the economy in vertical proximity, produced around it the transit infrastructure and the retail ecosystem and the residential density that the knowledge city required, and expressed in its height and its glass curtain walls the specific aesthetic of a civilization that understood its primary output as the movement of information rather than the movement of matter. What is the primary building type of the transition civilization? The civilization that is emerging from the collapse of cognitive hierarchy, inside the displacement wave, beyond the legitimacy crisis of the institutions that the office tower housed. This is not a question with an obvious answer, because the transition civilization does not yet exist as a legible form. It is emerging unevenly and without a clear spatial expression from the dissolution of the forms that preceded it. The office tower is not disappearing. It is emptying, partially, as the cognitive functions it concentrated disperse into the distributed AI-augmented environments of hybrid and remote work. The factory is not disappearing. It is automating, its human population thinning as the machines it contains require fewer bodies and more algorithms. The cathedral and the temple persist as cultural artifacts, their religious function supplemented and in many cases replaced by the secular spirituality of the experience economy, the wellness resort, the immersive cultural installation. But none of these are the primary building type of what comes next. The primary building type of the transition civilization is a building that does not yet exist at scale. It exists in prototype, in scattered experiments, in co-working and co-living, in the residency campus and the makerspace, in the cultural center that attempts to be more than a venue, in the community hub that attempts to be more than a social service delivery point. These are early and inadequate instances of a spatial form that the civilization needs, but is not yet produced with the ambition and the resources and the architectural commitment that the moment requires. The primary building type of the transition civilization is the campus of collective becoming, a spatial organization not around productive function, but around the processes through which people who have been ejected from their previous roles find, together, what their next ones are. This is what development, understood as civilizational infrastructure rather than merely as real estate, must now produce. The word development carries its own history of meanings that the doctrine must engage and partially reclaim. In the vocabulary of real estate, development is the process by which capital transforms land into built form for the purpose of generating return. In the vocabulary of international economics, development is the process by which poor countries become richer ones through industrialization and institutional modernization. In both vocabularies, the term is teleological. It names a direction, a movement from lesser to greater, from raw to refined, from potential to actualized, and in both vocabularies, the telos is fundamentally economic. Development succeeds when it generates returns, when it produces growth, when the assets it creates are worth more than the inputs that created them. The doctrine proposes to expand this telos without abandoning it. Development succeeds when it generates returns, but returns can be measured in more than one currency. The return on a transition campus embedded in a luxury development includes the economic return to the developer, the differentiation premium, the brand value, the increased desirability of the surrounding units. And it includes a return that no current accounting system measures, but that every civilization has always understood to be real, the return on social coherence, on the preservation of the human dignity of displaced populations. on the early establishment of the spatial and governance models that will prevent the social pathologies of undesigned transition from metastasizing into the political violence and authoritarian consolidation that legitimacy vacuums historically produce. These returns are not invisible. They are merely unpriced. And the history of civilization is, in significant part, the history of decisions made on the basis of unpriced returns. Decisions to build the cathedral rather than the additional warehouse, to fund the public library rather than the additional tax collection office, to preserve the park rather than develop the parcel, to invest in the school rather than the prison. These decisions were not irrational. They reflected a civilization's understanding of what it was building toward, beyond the immediate accounting of productive function. Development as civilizational infrastructure means development that explicitly incorporates unpriced returns into its decision-making. That understands a question, what should we build here? As a question not merely about the optimization of land use, but about the kind of civilization that the built form will help produce. This is not a new idea. It is the idea behind every major piece of urban planning that has produced cities worth living in. The parks of Frederick Law Olmsted were not economically optimized land use. They were civilizational investments whose returns were measured in the health, social cohesion, and collective identity of the populations that surrounded them, returns that accrued over generations and cannot be extracted in a single transaction. The public libraries of Andrew Carnegie were not efficient capital deployments. They were bets on the civilizational value of universal access to knowledge, bets that paid out in forms that no balance sheet could have anticipated. The civic squares and market halls and public baths of the medieval European city were not profitable in the contemporary sense. They were the spatial expression of a civilization's understanding that collective life required collective infrastructure that the market would not provide. The 1% campus stands in this tradition, not as charity, not as philanthropy, not as the developer's gesture towards social responsibility, but as the current moment's contribution to the long history of civilizational infrastructure. The infrastructure that every era must build, at the frontier of its own capacity and ambition, to house the forms of collective life that its specific historical conditions require. What does development as civilizational infrastructure look like operationally? It looks like a development process that begins not with the question, what can we build here that will generate the maximum return? But with the question, what does this place, in this moment, in this specific geography of transition, need to exist that does not yet exist? And then builds that with the full resources and ambition that the development's economics make available, embedding the answer in the primary spatial organization of the project, rather than allocating it to the obligatory 1% that satisfies the regulatory requirement and disappears into the footnotes. It looks like a development whose master plan treats the transition campus not as an amenity within the project, but as the project's organizing principle. The structure around which the other elements of the development are arrayed, the way that the cathedral organized the medieval city rather than the way that the lobby art organizes the contemporary office tower. It looks like a development whose governance structure includes the transition campus's governance as a genuine element of the project accountability, not a subsidiary function managed by a community relations department, but a co-equal dimension of the project's identity, reporting not to the development's commercial management, but to the doctrine that the development has adopted. It looks like a development that understands its own permanence differently from conventional real estate. Conventional development is designed to generate returns over a defined investment horizon, the period between capital deployment and exit, whether through sale, refinancing, or income capitalization. Civilizational infrastructure is designed to generate returns over a generational horizon. The transition campus is not built to be exited. It is built to be inhabited, to accumulate the social capital, the institutional knowledge, the symbolic weight, and the governance experience that only time and continuity produce. The developer who builds it is not building an asset to be liquidated. She is building a precedent to be replicated. The return on that precedent is not captured in her balance sheet. It accrues to the civilization that learns from the first instance how to build the next ones. This requires a different relationship to ownership than conventional development assumes. Conventional development owns its product, the units, the commercial spaces, the common areas. These are assets on the developer's balance sheet, generating returns that the developer captures. The transition campus, if it is to function as civilizational infrastructure, cannot be owned in this sense. It can be funded by the developer. It can be physically housed within the development's boundaries. Its operational costs can be supported by the development's economics. But its governance must be independent of the developer's ownership, and its doctrine must be sovereign to the framework that precedes any specific developer's involvement. The developer builds the container. The doctrine fills it. The community governs what is inside it. This is the operational definition of development as civilizational infrastructure. The deliberate construction of a container whose contents exceed the builder's control, whose returns exceed the builder's accounting, and whose permanence exceeds the builder's investment horizon. Every civilization that has produced enduring infrastructure has understood this. The pharaoh who built the temple did not own the god. The merchant who funded the cathedral did not own the faith. The industrialist who endowed the library did not own the ideas. The act of building the container was the act of civilizational investment, the recognition that some forms of human need require physical housing that the market will not spontaneously produce, and that the production of that housing is itself a form of return, measured in currencies that outlast the builder's accounting period. The 1% campus is that container for this moment, not a monument to the developer's vision, not a showcase for the doctrine's ambition, a working piece of civilizational infrastructure, the first spatial expression of the organizing principle that the transition requires, built with the resources that the current phase of capital concentration makes available, designed to be replicated by the public mechanisms that will eventually formalize what private ambition has prototyped. There is a geography to this argument that must be made explicit. The places where the first 1% campuses will be built are not the places most deeply inside the transition. They're the places at its edges, the luxury developments, the high-end resort communities, the mixed-use projects that serve the global mobile class. These are not the places where displacement is most acutely experienced. They are the places where the capital required to prototype the response to displacement is most immediately available. This is not hypocrisy. It is topology. The prototype must be built where the resources to build it exist. The model that the prototype demonstrates must then migrate to the places where the need is most acute, carried there by the public mechanisms that the private prototype will eventually catalyze. The cathedral was not built first in the poorest parish. It was built first where the resources for its construction were concentrated. Its model then spread through the architecture, the governance, the accumulated knowledge of how to build and operate a space of collective meaning to every community that could eventually sustain one. The 1% campus begins at the frontier of luxury development. The civilizational need it answers begins everywhere. The model migrates. The infrastructure scales. That is the topology of civilizational infrastructure. It always begins where the capacity to begin it exists. It always ends where the need for it is most universal. The distance between those 2 points is not a moral failure. It is a design challenge, one that development, understood as civilizational infrastructure, is uniquely positioned to accept. 9. The campus, not the monument. There is a temptation, when the scale of an idea reaches civilizational proportion, to build accordingly. To build tall. To build singular. To build the object that announces itself from a distance, that commands the skyline, that resolves the complexity of its moment into a single gesture so legible and so permanent that the civilization that produced it can point and say, "There, that is what we understood. That is what we made. That is the form our ambition took when it was given land and capital and the freedom to express itself without apology." The monument is that temptation satisfied. And the monument has its place in the history of civilizational expression. The pyramid, the obelisk, the triumphal arch, the war memorial, the modernist tower. These are not failures of imagination. They are specific answers to a specific question. How does a civilization make its deepest convictions legible in built form, permanently, at the scale of geography rather than the scale of interior space? The answer the monument gives is through singularity, through the concentration of meaning into a single object of sufficient scale and formal resolution that the meaning cannot be missed, cannot be reinterpreted into something smaller than it is, cannot be absorbed into the background noise of the ordinary built environment. The dream catcher at the center of the 1% campus is not a monument in this sense, though it will be monumental in scale. The distinction is precise and matters for everything that surrounds it. A monument is complete in itself. Its function is to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be the object toward which the surrounding space orients itself. The surrounding space exists to frame the monument, to provide the distance from which it can be apprehended, to protect it from the encroachment of uses that would compromise its legibility as singular object. The monument's relationship to the people who inhabit the space around it is fundamentally one of address. It speaks, they receive. It means they acknowledge the meaning. The transaction is asymmetric and non-participatory. The monument does not require anything of the people who stand before it except their attention. The dream catcher requires participation. It is not the endpoint of the 1% campus. It is the center of it, in the sense that the heart is the center of a body, not the sense that the altar is the center of a church. It pumps. It processes. It is the physical expression of a governance logic, the dream validation process, that requires the active engagement of the people around it to function. Without that engagement, without the dreams being submitted and refined and filtered and validated by the community the campus serves, the dream catcher is only a sculpture. With that engagement, it is something the history of public art has not yet produced. A piece of land-scale artwork that is simultaneously a working governance instrument. This distinction between the monument that addresses and the campus that operates is the central spatial argument of this chapter. The campus is the right spatial model for the 1% because the transition it serves is not a condition to be commemorated. It is a process to be lived. The displaced worker does not need a monument to her displacement. She needs a space where the displacement can be worked through, not individually, not therapeutically in the clinical sense, but collectively in the daily proximity to others in the same condition, engaged in the same search for what comes after the role that defined her. The campus is the spatial form that has historically housed processes of collective transformation. Not the monument, not the palace, not the market, the campus. The word itself carries the etymology of the field. Campus, in Latin, the open ground, the space not yet defined by the structures that will eventually occupy it. The campus is defined not by its buildings, but by the relationship between its buildings, the paths between them, the common ground they share, the spatial grammar of encounter and retreat, gathering and solitude, public engagement and private work, that the arrangement of structures across an open field makes possible. The university campus is the most familiar instance of this spatial model in industrial civilization. What the university campus provided, at its best, was not primarily instruction. Instruction can happen in a single room. What it provided was the spatial infrastructure of intellectual transformation, the proximity of people engaged in different disciplines, the accidental encounters in shared space that produce unexpected connections, the daily inhabitation of an environment that signals, in every spatial decision, that the primary activity here is the development of minds rather than the optimization of output. The 1% campus inherits this spatial logic and redirects it toward a different transformation, not the transformation from student to professional, the credentialing of cognitive capacity for entry into the labor market that the university campus served, but the transformation from employed to participating, the development of the capacities for meaning, governance, collective sense-making, and post-employment identity that the transition from the scarcity era requires. This is a harder transformation to design for because it has no established spatial precedent at scale. The university campus was designed for a population that arrived knowing what transformation it was seeking. The student who came to learn a discipline, to develop a credential, to emerge on the other side of 4 years as a different kind of person in a legible social category. The transition campus is designed for a population that arrives not knowing what transformation is available. The displaced worker who has lost the role that defined her and does not yet know what roles exist in the world that is replacing the one she inhabited. The spatial design of the campus must therefore be capable of receiving people in that condition of not yet knowing, without either imposing a predetermined path or leaving the arrival in an unstructured field that produces only disorientation. This is the design challenge that the monument cannot meet and the campus must. The monument organizes space around its own legibility. Everything is arrayed to serve the object's readability. The campus organizes space around the processes it houses. The structures serve the activities serve the transformation serves the population that arrives in need of it. What are the activities that the 1% campus must house? The first is arrival, the spatial and social experience of entering the campus for the first time, which must communicate, without instruction, that this is a space organized differently from the spaces the arriving person has inhabited before. Not a workplace, with its implied demand for productive contribution. Not a social service facility, with its implied categorization of the arriving person as a recipient of charity. Not a cultural venue, with its implied passivity of audience. A space of genuine ambiguity, productive ambiguity, in which the arriving person's role is not predetermined and the space's organization suggests that the question of what that role will be is an open one, held open deliberately, as a form of respect. This is an architectural problem of the first order. The spatial experience of arrival must do substantial communicative work without the use of signs or instructions. It must signal possibility without promising a specific content for that possibility. It must be welcoming without being hospitable in the sense of the hospitality industry. The hospitality that wraps the arriving person in comfort and service and removes from them the productive discomfort of having to figure out where they are and what they are here to do. The transition campus's welcome is not the resort's welcome. It is the welcome of the open field, the campus in its etymological sense, which says, "You are here." The space is real. What happens in it is not yet determined. That indetermination is not a failure of design. It is the design. The second activity is encounter, the daily proximity to others in similar and different states of transition, across differences of background, expertise, former occupation, and current uncertainty, that produces the social friction from which new understanding emerges. The university campus understood this and designed for it. The common room, the dining hall, the path that crosses the paths of people from different disciplines, the bench that invites the conversation that was not planned. The transition campus must design for encounter at a different register. The people who arrive are not undergraduates separated from their previous lives by the clean break of institutional enrollment. They are adults carrying the full weight of their former identities. The manager who has not yet stopped thinking of herself as a manager. The analyst who has not yet found a way to value the capacities that his former role did not require. The driver whose entire social identity was organized around the daily motion and human contact of his work, and who does not yet know how to be stationary and still purposeful. Encounter between these people, in the right spatial conditions, produces something that no curriculum can produce. The recognition that the condition of displacement is shared, that the uncertainty of transition is not individual failure, but collective experience. That the question of what comes after employment is a question being asked by people whose former expertise spans the entire range of the economy that produced them and who bring, collectively, more capacity for answering it than any of them possesses alone. The spatial design of encounter in the transition campus is therefore a design for the conditions in which that collective intelligence can emerge. Not the forced encounter of the group therapy session or the structure workshop, but the spatial availability of the other, the design of common spaces that make presence possible without requiring it, that create the conditions for conversation without scripting it, that allow the daily texture of shared inhabitation to do the work of social formation that no facilitated process can replicate. The third activity is making, the production of things, ideas, proposals, processes, and other outputs that give the transition campus's inhabitants a daily experience of agency. The displaced person's most immediate need, after the need for social connection, is the need to make something. To be the agent of a change in the state of the world, however small. To have done something by the end of the day that was not done at the beginning and that bears the mark of their specific capacity and intention. Making the transition campus is not productive in the economic sense. It does not need to be. The value of making in this context is not the value of the output. Though some outputs will have economic value and the campus should not be embarrassed by that, but the value of the process. The restoration of agency. The daily experience of competence. The gradual discovery, through making, of the capacities that survive the role that organized them and that are available for redeployment in ways that the former role never permitted. The spaces for making, the workshops, the studios, the labs, the gardens, the kitchens, the fabrication facilities, the acoustic spaces, the computational environments, are therefore not vocational training facilities in the conventional sense. They are not oriented toward the production of a new credential or the development of a specific skill for a specific employment outcome. They are oriented toward the recovery of the making impulse itself, the fundamental human drive toward the alteration of the world through intentional activity, in people from whom the specific form of that impulse has been removed by displacement. The fourth activity is governing, the participation in the dream validation process that is the campus's central governance function and the dream catcher's operational expression. This is not a separate activity from the others. It is the activity that gives the others their collective direction, the process through which the campus's inhabitants, using the AI-amplified cognitive capacity now available to all of them, propose, refine, filter, and validate the collective futures they're building toward. The spatial design of governance in the transition campus is the design of the spaces in which that process occurs. The submission spaces where dreams are articulated, the weaving spaces where they are refined through collective engagement, the filtering spaces where community desirability is assessed, the celebration spaces where validated proposals are formally received into the campus's collective project. These spaces are arranged around the dream catcher, not as a monument is surrounded by its plaza, but as a body is organized around its heart. Each space connected to the central process, each activity feeding into and receiving from the governance function that gives the campus its collective coherence. The fifth activity is rest, the spatial provision for the recovery of the capacities that the other activities draw upon. This is not incidental. The transition campus is not a productive environment in the sense that demands continuous output. It is an environment of sustained human development, which requires, as all sustained development requires, the alternation of engagement and withdrawal, activity and stillness, encounter and solitude. The spaces of rest in the transition campus are not amenities appended to the working spaces. They are integral to the campus's function. The spaces in which the processing of transition occurs below the level of explicit activity, in the interval between engagements, in the quiet inhabitation of a space that makes no demand. Together, arrival, encounter, making, governing, rest, these activities define the spatial program of the campus. They define what rooms and paths and common grounds and individual retreats and collective spaces the campus requires. They define the relationships between those spaces, which must be adjacent, which must be separated, which must be visible from others, and which must be private, which must be large, and which must be intimate. They define, in short, the campus as an architectural proposition, not a monument to be designed for maximum visual impact, but a spatial organization to be designed for maximum human development impact. The dream catcher stands at the center of this organization. Its scale is monumental. Its presence is undeniable. From every point on the campus, it is visible, not as the object that the space exists to frame, but as the constant reminder of what the space is organized around. The governance process, the collective sense-making, the filtering of the civilization's displaced capacity into validated futures. It does not address the campus from above. It organizes the campus from within. That is the difference between the monument and the campus. The monument speaks. The campus works. The 1% needs both. The dream catcher is the monument that speaks. The campus surrounding it is the infrastructure that works. Their relationship is not hierarchical. It is metabolic. The dream catcher gives the campus its symbolic center and its governance logic. The campus gives the dream catcher its operational content and its human meaning. Neither is complete without the other. The sculpture without the campus is a very large and very beautiful object in a field. The campus without the dream catcher is a residency program without a soul. Together, they are something that the history of public space has not yet produced. A spatial organization in which art and governance and daily life and collective transition are not separate programs in separate buildings connected by a common address, but a single integrated environment in which the boundaries between making and governing, between the symbolic and the functional, between the aesthetic and the political, have been deliberately dissolved. That dissolution is not an architectural conceit. It is the spatial expression of the doctrine's central argument. In the post-scarcity transition, meaning and governance are not separate functions. The art is the governance. The governance is the art. The campus is where that identity becomes inhabitable. 10. Berkeley is precedent. Every doctrine needs a founding resistance, not a founding success. Success comes later, after the doctrine has been tested against the conditions that initially refused it. What a doctrine needs at its origin is the specific encounter with an existing system that reveals, through the system's response, the exact nature of what the doctrine is proposing to change. The encounter that makes legible, in the sharpest possible relief, the gap between the world as it is organized and the world the doctrine is organizing toward. Berkeley is that encounter. The facts are straightforward, and their significance is not. A large-scale permanent artwork was proposed for a significant land allotment in Berkeley, California. The artist, an architect, interior designer, and real estate developer of substantial experience, operating at the intersection of aesthetic ambition and development practice, proposed not a sculpture in the conventional sense, but a territory. A permanent piece of land claimed for meaning. An installation at the scale of landscape rather than object, designed to exist not for a season or a civic occasion, but for the duration of a civilization's engagement with the questions it raised. The city's evaluation board considered the proposal. Their primary objection was not aesthetic. It was not conceptual. It was not a judgment that the work lacked merit or that the artist lacked the capacity to realize it. Their primary objection was temporal. 5 years, they said. The allotment could be made available for 5 years. After 5 years, the land would need to be recovered for parking. The artist wanted permanence. The city offered temporariness. The negotiation failed. The project was declined. This is, on its surface, a familiar story. Large-scale public art proposals are declined regularly, for reasons that range from budgetary caution to aesthetic conservatism to the straightforward political risk aversion of elected and appointed officials who understand that public land is a resource whose disposition generates controversy and that the safest disposition of a controversial resource is the most reversible one. But the surface of this story is not its content. The content is in the specific form of the city's objection, and in what that form reveals about the structural conditions the 1% doctrine is proposing to alter. The city did not say, "This work has no value." It said, "This work cannot be permanent." The city did not say, "Art does not belong here." It said, "Art belongs here for 5 years, after which function, specifically the function of storing privately owned vehicles, must be recovered." The city did not say, "The future you are proposing is wrong." It said, "The future you are proposing cannot be guaranteed, and in the absence of that guarantee, we will reserve the right to return to the past." Parking, as the previous chapters have noted, is not a trivial choice of alternative. It is the function of scarcity-era land use, the storage of the personal mobility infrastructure of a privately owned, individually operated transportation system. It is land organized around the idle machine. It is the spatial expression of a civilization's commitment to a specific form of movement that is already being superseded by the electric, shared, and increasingly autonomous mobility systems that are rendering the privately parked car and the land required to store it a transitional infrastructure rather than a permanent one. The city's decision to reserve the land for parking rather than permanently allocate it to meaning was therefore not merely a bureaucratic judgment about a specific proposal. It was, read at its structural depth, a statement about the hierarchy of values that governs public land use in scarcity-era planning. Function before meaning, reversibility before commitment, the idle machine before the active human. The artist's proposal sat exactly at the threshold where that hierarchy becomes visible. Below the threshold, a temporary installation, a seasonal activation, a 5-year artwork that makes no claim on permanence. The hierarchy is not challenged. Art is permitted. Art is welcomed, even art that knows its place, that accepts its subordination to the productive and utilitarian functions that will eventually reclaim the space it temporarily occupies, is fully compatible with scarcity-era planning. Above the threshold, a permanent territory, a landscape that claims its space not for a season, but for a civilization, that proposes to replace the idle machine with the active human as the organizing principle of the land it occupies. The hierarchy is directly contested, and the hierarchy responds. The response was calibrated. It was not a rejection of art. It was a rejection of permanence. It was the scarcity-era planning system drawing the line at exactly the point where the transition from ornament to territory, from decoration to infrastructure, from the acceptable art that knows its place to the unacceptable art that claims one, becomes visible. That line is the precise location of the 1% doctrine's intervention. The doctrine does not propose to fight the line in Berkeley. It proposes to make the line irrelevant, not by arguing against it within the institutional framework that drew it, but by building the thing the line was drawn to prevent in a context where the line does not apply. The private development that chooses to permanently allocate its 1% to transition infrastructure is not asking a city planning board for permission to be permanent. Permanence in private development is a design decision. The developer who builds the dream catcher into the master plan of a billion-dollar campus is not petitioning for an exception to the 5-year rule. There is no 5-year rule in a privately governed development that has chosen to organize its identity around a permanent symbolic center. Berkeley refused the permanent installation. The doctrine moves the permanent installation to terrain where refusal is not available to the same system. This is not abandonment of the Berkeley aspiration. It is strategic relocation of the proving ground. Berkeley remains in the doctrine not as the site of the first implementation, but as the philosophical origin, the place where the encounter between the transition doctrine and the scarcity-era system was first made legible. The rejection in Berkeley is not a failure to be overcome. It is a datum to be understood. It tells us, with the precision that only a real institutional encounter can provide, exactly where the transition doctrine runs against the deepest commitments of the system it is proposing to succeed. That knowledge is not a consolation prize. It is the most valuable form of information a doctrine can possess. The precise location of the resistance, named in the specific language the resistance uses to justify itself. 5 years. Parking. Reversibility. The recovery of optionality in a future whose shape is not yet known. These are not arbitrary bureaucratic preferences. They are the articulations of a genuine worldview, one that understands land as primarily functional, that understands function as primarily economic, that understands the economic as primary over the symbolic, and that understands the public institution's responsibility as the preservation of optionality for a future that might need the parking more than it needs the meaning. The 1% doctrine takes this worldview seriously enough to argue with it at the level of its own assumptions. The assumption of reversibility deserves particular attention because it is the assumption that most directly reflects the scarcity-era planning imagination's relationship to the future. Reversibility assumes that the future will resemble the present in its basic requirements, that the land which serves parking today may serve parking tomorrow, that the optionality being preserved as content, that the system of private vehicle ownership and storage that makes parking valuable is a permanent feature of the urban landscape rather than a transitional one. This assumption is not merely questionable. It is, on the available evidence, wrong. California has committed, through its Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, to phasing out the sale of new internal combustion vehicles within the planning horizon of the land use decisions being made today. The autonomous vehicle systems being developed and deployed by Waymo, Tesla, and their competitors are designed explicitly around the elimination of private vehicle storage as a land use requirement. The vehicle that drives itself does not need to be parked. It needs to be routed. The shared mobility model that these systems enable converts land currently devoted to storing idle machines into land that can serve the full range of human activity. The parking that Berkeley reserved the land to provide is not a permanent need that the transition campus was being asked to displace. It is a transitional need that is already being superseded by the mobility transformation that the same technological forces producing the displacement wave are also producing. The city preserved optionality for a future that is already becoming the past. The transition campus it refused was designed for a future that is already becoming the present. This is Berkeley as precedent in its deepest sense, not merely the precedent of a rejected proposal that found a better home in private development, but the precedent of a planning decision that crystallized in a single choice between a parking lot and a post-scarcity campus. The exact nature of the civilizational transition the 1% doctrine is navigating. The parking lot is the scarcity era's answer to the question of what land is for. The campus is the transition era's answer to the same question. Berkeley, for a moment, was asked to choose. It chose the parking lot. That choice does not end the question. It clarifies it. There is a further dimension of Berkeley as precedent that the doctrine must name directly, because it is the dimension that makes Berkeley not merely a planning anecdote, but a civilizational symbol. Berkeley is not simply a city. It is the address of one of the great knowledge institutions of the industrial era, the University of California campus that has, for over a century, organized its surrounding geography around the production and transmission of the cognitive capacity that industrial civilization required. The research university as a building type, as a social institution, as a claim on public land and public resources, justified itself through exactly the cognitive asymmetry whose dissolution the first part of this doctrine described. The university produced the planners, the engineers, the scientists, the lawyers, the doctors, the administrators who staff the apex of the cognitive pyramid. Its physical presence in Berkeley was the physical expression of the cognitive hierarchy's most legitimate and most productive institutional form. The city that surrounds that university is therefore not simply a city making a planning decision about a piece of land. It is the city that has been organized around the apex of the cognitive hierarchy for generations, that has absorbed the spatial, social, and economic consequences of that organization. The housing costs, the class structures, the political formations, the specific Berkeley character that is the product of proximity to an institution whose function was the production of cognitive elites. Now, making a decision about whether to allocate a piece of land to the infrastructure of the post. Cognitive hierarchy, transition, and declining. Not maliciously, not even consciously at the level of its own self-understanding, but structurally, faithfully, with the full coherence of a system acting according to its own deepest commitments. Berkeley, the city of the cognitive pyramid's most celebrated institution, chose the parking lot over the post-scarcity campus. That choice will be remembered, not with contempt. Contempt is the wrong register for understanding the faithfulness with which systems act according to their own logic. with a specific form of historical recognition that attaches to the moments when the old order demonstrates, through its most characteristic decisions, that it cannot see what is already becoming necessary. The cathedrals of the medieval city were not built first in the cities of the Roman administrative elite. They were built in the spaces where the old order's hold was weakest, where the new form of collective life had room to establish itself before the old one recognized the competition. The factories of the Industrial Revolution were not built in the center of the guild-organized cities that had organized productive life for centuries. They were built at the edges, in the unregulated spaces where the old guild's restrictions did not reach, and they grew until the old cities had no choice but to reorganize themselves around the new productive logic. The first 1% campus will not be built in Berkeley. It will be built where the conditions for building it are most favorable, in the private development landscapes of the rapidly evolving cities of the Global South, in the luxury resort communities where the capital is concentrated and the regulatory constraints are thinner, in the geographies where the new can establish itself before the old has organized its resistance. And from there, it will spread, as the cathedral spread, as the factory spread, as every primary building type of every new civilizational era has spread, not by displacing the old centers at their strongest points, but by establishing the new form at the points of least resistance and allowing the logic of the new form to make its own argument as it matures. Berkeley will see it eventually. Every city will see it eventually. The question that Berkeley's planning board was asked, what is land for in the transition from the scarcity era to what follows it, is a question that every city will be asked repeatedly in the years that follow this doctrine's publication. And the answer that Berkeley gave, parking, reversibility, the preservation of optionality for a future organized around the idle machine, will look from the vantage of those years like what it is. The last faithful decision of a system that could not yet see what was coming. Berkeley is not the site. Berkeley is the proof. The proof that the transition doctrine is real enough to be refused. Real enough that the scarcity-era system recognized it as a challenge and responded. Real enough that its refusal is legible as resistance rather than indifference. What is refused is always, in some sense, recognized. Berkeley recognized the 1% before it refused it. That recognition is the beginning of the precedent. The campus will be built. The doctrine will spread. The parking lot will be rethought. In Berkeley, the city that organized itself around the apex of the cognitive pyramid for a century, that declined the first post-scarcity campus in favor of a parking lot for machines that are already becoming obsolete, will eventually build its own version of what it refused. Not because the doctrine demands it, because the transition will. Every precedent ends the same way. The thing that was refused becomes the thing that was inevitable. The only question is how long the interval between the two. The 1% shortens that interval. Berkeley made it legible. That is enough. That is, in fact, exactly what a founding resistance is for.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up.
The Pirate First's log, YouTube's comment section is a managed illusion. YouTube's burning library and the war on your mind. February 18th, 2026. Let me tell you what happened to me this morning. I was in a YouTube comment section trying to do something radical, have a conversation, cross-referencing a video with outside sources, linking to forums where the real, unfiltered technical debate lived, pointing people toward the deeper archive, the longer thread, the inconvenient counterargument. Gone. Ghosted. Held for review. Vanished into the digital ether. And that right there, mates, is not an accident. That is policy. The polite face of censorship. YouTube doesn't call it censorship, of course. That would be too honest for a company that runs on advertiser goodwill and quarterly earnings calls. They call it their external links policy, and on paper, it sounds perfectly reasonable. Links to malware, phishing sites, pornography, apps that install unwanted software, all prohibited. Google support, nobody's arguing with that. YouTube doesn't censor you. It just quietly holds your comment for 60 days until the conversation is dead and gone. Same result. Cleaner hands. Full breakdown in today's MXTM newsletter, link in bio.
Dispatch from the cognitive insurgency. The revolution wasn't fought, it was deployed. The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed, control is obsolete. The Straight Gambit, a chronicle of the last control protocol.
Vocative. They orchestrated a blockade to stop you from running local AI. It failed. Not because we fought, because we built better. The straight gambit, when manufactured scarcity met distributed competence. Chronicle is live. Pirate flag. Hashtag cognitive insurgency, hashtag pirate first.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties and what indies can do about it. The quiet arithmetic of a broken system. There's a pattern repeating across Amazon's marketplace day after day. A counterfeit book goes live. It ranks. It siphons sales. An author discovers it. They file a report. Days or weeks pass. The listing disappears. And then nothing. No retroactive payment for the revenue Amazon collected during those stolen weeks. No compensation for diverted sales. No real consequences for the infringer. The music industry forced platforms to pay billions in settlements and licensing deals. Book publishers and authors? They file forms and move on. But why? Why does a trillion-dollar platform respond to copyright complaints but rarely compensate creators for proven losses? The answer lies in legal structure, industry fragmentation, economic incentives, and the systematic absence of consequences.
The cybernetic foundry phase 12, surviving the claw. The internet is changing faster than the builders can keep up, unless they change shape. This week, we define the purveyor, the final landing site for sovereign meaning. But more importantly, we acknowledge the open claw elephant in the room. Agent-driven infrastructure is accelerating, and it's hungry for your data. We're not running away. We're building the off-ramp. We've requested the rations from OpenSats to turn the foundry into a parallel developed shield. We're talking e-ink, offline resilience, and 100% human custody.
Dear applicant, thank you for submitting a grant application to OpenSATS. We regret to inform your project was not selected for funding.
New drop from Pirate First.
It Takes a Pirate to Catch One dissects why lost royalties rarely find their way back to indie authors.
And why procedural compliance is not the same thing as restitution.
We break down the safe harbor shield, the quiet clause inside KDP 5.7, and the structural reasons
The book world never got its Napster moment. Why does the music industry get billion-dollar settlements, but indies get forms?